There is a claim circulating widely right now that says this, that Black Americans were originally native to the Americas and were later reclassified as African American. That claim mixes real history with incorrect conclusions. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly what happened using law, census records, population history, and DNA science. And I'm going to be very clear about where the evidence ends and where speculation begins. This is not about debate. It's about accuracy. Before anything else, we need to separate four things that are often collapsed into one. 1. Legal classification, how the state labeled people. 2. Record keeping, how those labels were written down. 3. Biological ancestry, what DNA can and cannot show. 4. Identity and community, how people actually lived. When these get blurred together, confusion looks like truth. So we're going to keep them distinct.
That distinction matters because paper, blood, and belonging are not the same thing.
Exactly. And history breaks when we pretend they are. Here's the first fact, stated plainly. Yes, Indigenous people in the United States were legally and administratively reclassified as Black or colored, especially in the Southeast. That is documented history. It happened through laws, census practices, and vital records, not through a single announcement, but through decades of policy. This is why some families can trace Native ancestors in oral history, but find those ancestors listed as colored on paper. That part is real.
So when families say, we were Native and then we were called Black, they're often describing what happened in the records.
Yes, they're describing reclassification, not imagination. Now, here's the boundary that must be stated just as clearly. That documented reclassification does not mean that most Black Americans were originally Indigenous and not African. Those are two very different claims. One is supported by records. The other is not. Millions of Africans were forcibly brought to what became the United States through the transatlantic slave trade. That history is documented through shipping records, plantation inventories, and population data. Reclassification erased Indigenous identity on paper. It did not invent African ancestry. Both truths exist at the same time. This confusion feels larger than it is for two reasons. First, reclassification often erased entire communities at once, which makes the loss feel massive. Second, African ancestry was intentionally stigmatized under slavery and segregation, while Indigenous identity was romanticized or denied. So when people go searching for dignity, they sometimes reach for replacement stories instead of layered truth. But replacing one history with another does not restore what was lost.
It just creates a new distortion.
Exactly. DNA testing is often treated like a final judge. It isn't. DNA compares your genetic segments to reference populations that exist today. If a population was erased, displaced, or never included in databases, DNA cannot fully reflect it. That means DNA can undercount Indigenous ancestry, especially from the Southeast. But here is what DNA does show very clearly at the population level. African ancestry is dominant in Black Americans. That finding is consistent across millions of tests, across companies, and across decades of research.
Confirmation. DNA absence is not proof of ancestral absence. However, population-level dominance is statistically robust.
So here's the framework we'll use for the rest of this series. We acknowledge Indigenous erasure without inflating its scale. We respect African ancestry without minimizing trauma. We use DNA as a tool, not an identity verdict. And we refuse replacement myths, even when they feel emotionally satisfying. This is how truth stays intact. Here is the takeaway from Act 1. Reclassification happened. Erasure happened. African ancestry is real and documented. DNA has limits. And confusion today is the inheritance of policy, not proof of a hidden majority. In Act 2, I'm going to walk you step by step through the law that caused the deepest damage, Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, and show you exactly how identity was altered on paper. That's where this story becomes undeniable. The reclassification of Indigenous people in Virginia did not happen accidentally. It happened through law. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, a statute that fundamentally reshaped how human beings were recorded by the state. This law did three critical things. First, it required every birth certificate to list a person's race. Second, it enforced racial separation through marriage restrictions. Third, it reduced legal racial identity to only two categories, white and colored. There was no legally recognized category for Native American identity. This structure mattered. When a law forces identity into only two options, anything that does not fit is eliminated by default. Indigenous people in Virginia were not debated out of existence. They were administratively removed.
Confirmation. Omission from legal categories functions as erasure when documentation continuity is required for recognition.
The law did include a narrow exception. It allowed people with 1/16 or less Native ancestry to still be classified as white. This exception existed almost exclusively to protect elite white families who claimed descent from Pocahontas. This exception did not protect Indigenous communities. It protected whiteness.
So Native identity was acceptable only when it didn't disrupt racial hierarchy.
Exactly. Laws do not enforce themselves. In Virginia, enforcement centered on one office, the Bureau of Vital Statistics. At the head of that office was Walter Plecker. As registrar, Plecker controlled how race was recorded on birth, marriage, and death certificates. That control determined legal identity for generations. Plecker did not view Indigenous identity as legitimate. He believed Virginia Indians no longer existed as a distinct population and actively worked to prevent Native classification in records. He sent letters to local registrars instructing them to reject Indian as a racial designation, reclassify families he believed to be mixed, monitor specific surnames and communities. This was not passive record keeping. It was racial policing.
Assessment. This constitutes intentional administrative suppression of Indigenous classification.
Here's how this played out in everyday life. A child was born into a family that identified as Native. The family presented that identity to the local registrar. The registrar, following state guidance, refused to record Indian. The child was recorded as colored. That designation followed the person for life. When they married, the marriage license said colored. When they died, the death certificate said colored. For future generations, the paper trail now stated that this family had never been Indigenous at all.
So descendants inherited documentation that contradicted lived reality.
Yes, that contradiction is the core of modern confusion. This process did not affect only individuals. It affected entire communities. Indigenous groups across Virginia continued to exist socially and culturally while disappearing from official records. When later generations sought recognition, the state pointed to its own altered records as proof that these communities had never existed. That circular logic was devastating. This is where modern DNA testing enters the conversation and where its limits must be understood. DNA compares people to existing reference populations, but many southeastern tribes were reclassified early, forced into mixed communities, disrupted before genetic databases existed, or excluded from DNA testing for sovereignty reasons. DNA cannot compare you to a population that has been erased from records and databases.
Conclusion. Genetic analysis cannot reconstruct identities erased by administrative policy.
It is important to be precise. The Racial Integrity Act did erase Indigenous identity from legal records, did collapse Native people into colored, did disrupt lineage documentation. It did not invent African ancestry, replace Indigenous ancestry with African ancestry biologically, reclassify millions of Africans retroactively. Administrative race is not genetic origin. Confusing the two produces false conclusions. Virginia's system did not remain isolated. Its approach influenced census practices, school enrollment, marriage enforcement, racial logic in neighboring states. The result was a model where race replaced nationhood across much of the Southeast. Here is the takeaway from Act 2. Indigenous identity in Virginia was erased through law. That erasure was intentional and enforced. Records were altered in ways that still affect descendants. DNA cannot fully repair damage done by legal reclassification. In Act 3, the focus shifts to genetics. I will explain exactly what DNA can show, what it cannot, and why Indigenous ancestry is often underdetected without being absent. DNA ancestry testing does not identify nations, tribes, or lived identity. It measures genetic similarity between segments of your DNA and reference populations that exist today. This distinction is critical. DNA does not tell stories. DNA measures probability. When this difference is misunderstood, DNA is asked to answer questions it was never designed to answer. Most commercial DNA tests rely on autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA comes from both parents, reflects all ancestral lines, is strongest for the most recent 5 to 8 generations. What it does not do is preserve every ancestor equally. With each generation, DNA recombines, segments are shuffled, some ancestral DNA is inherited, some is not. An ancestor can be fully real in your family history and completely absent from your DNA results.
So genealogy remembers everyone. DNA remembers only what survives inheritance.
Exactly. Indigenous ancestry in Black Americans often entered family lines earlier and through fewer ancestors. African ancestry, by contrast, entered later, entered repeatedly, came from many individuals. This makes African ancestry genetically dominant and Indigenous ancestry genetically fragile. Over generations, small ancestral contributions decay. This is not erasure by design. It is inheritance mathematics.
Technical confirmation. Ancestral signal strength decreases exponentially with generational distance.
Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, tracks only one line, your direct maternal line. It ignores your father, your paternal grandmother, every ancestor outside that single path. If Indigenous ancestry entered your family through any other line, mtDNA will not detect it. mtDNA is precise. It is also extremely limited.
It tells the truth, just not the whole truth.
Correct. Y-DNA follows the direct paternal line only. It captures father to father to father. Any Indigenous ancestry outside that exact path will never appear. This makes Y-DNA useful for studying one lineage, but inappropriate for defining overall ancestry.
Confirmation. Y-DNA represents a single ancestral pathway among thousands.
DNA test results often differ between companies. This does not indicate error in your DNA. It reflects differences in reference populations, statistical models, confidence thresholds, update schedules. As databases expand, interpretations change. Your ancestry remains constant. The model improves.
So when a percentage disappears, it wasn't stolen, it was reclassified statistically.
Exactly. Indigenous DNA that cannot be confidently matched is not reassigned to another group. It either falls below reporting thresholds, remains unassigned, or becomes statistically indistinguishable. This is especially common when reference populations are missing or underrepresented. DNA does not move ancestry percentages around intentionally. It reports only what it can identify with confidence.
Statistical protocol avoids forced assignment under low confidence.
Southeastern Indigenous ancestry is among the hardest to detect because reclassification occurred early, communities were forced to mix, population continuity was disrupted, many tribes are absent from DNA databases. This limits resolution, not reality.
Absence of reference populations constrains classification accuracy.
DNA cannot answer questions of belonging. It cannot determine cultural identity, tribal citizenship, lived experience, community acceptance. Using DNA to gate identity misunderstands both genetics and sovereignty.
DNA explains biology. Identity is human.
Yes, DNA should be used as part of a larger framework. Responsibly used, DNA identifies relatives, builds family clusters, supports documentary evidence. It should never be used alone to confirm or deny heritage claims.
Recommended practice: evidence triangulation across genetics, records, and oral history.
Here's the takeaway from Act 3. DNA measures similarity, not nationhood. Autosomal DNA fades with time. mtDNA and Y-DNA reflect single lines. Indigenous ancestry is often underdetected, not absent. DNA cannot repair legal erasure. DNA must be used alongside records and history. In Act 4, the focus shifts from science to people. I will show how Indigenous nations became racial categories, how communities survived while records disappeared, and how this transformation still shapes identity today. Before racial categories took over, people here identified as nations. They were bound by language, kinship, land, and responsibility to one another. When colonial governance expanded, identity stopped being relational and became administrative. People were no longer asked who they were assigned where they fit. That shift replaced nationhood with race.
Anthropological confirmation. Racialization simplifies governance by collapsing complex identities into hierarchical categories.
The Southeast experienced this transformation earlier and more aggressively than most regions. Several forces converged here: early colonization, native enslavement, forced proximity with enslaved Africans, strict state control of records. Communities adapted to survive. That adaptation was later misread as disappearance. Indigenous communities in Virginia did not vanish. Their paper trails were cut. This included communities connected to the Chickahominy tribe, Rappahannock tribe, Monacan Indian Nation, Nansemond Indian Nation, and Upper Mattaponi tribe. Families remained on ancestral land. Churches and kin networks persisted. Culture continued. But when records allowed only white or colored, Indigenous continuity went undocumented.
Survival continued even when visibility didn't.
Exactly. Across the Southeast and Gulf Coast, Afro-Indigenous communities formed through shared geography, coercion, and choice. These communities were not uniform in ancestry. They were made uniform by the state. The label colored collapsed. Indigenous people, African-descended people, mixed families. Distinct histories were compressed into one administrative outcome.
Pattern identified, Categorical collapse replaces relational identity with a single bureaucratic label.
Surnames appear frequently in discussions of erasure. State officials circulated lists of families they believed should not be recorded as Indian or white. These lists guided registrars. A surname on such a list does not prove ancestry. It proves surveillance. Surnames are leads to places and counties where policing occurred. They are not verdicts.
They map power, not blood.
Exactly. Census categories shifted repeatedly. A family might appear as Indian in one decade, mulatto in the next, colored later. Not because the family changed, but because the rules did. Reading census data without legal and local context produces false conclusions about identity.
Data integrity note: longitudinal classification bias must be accounted for.
Descendants inherit a contradiction. Oral history says indigenous. Records say colored. DNA shows primarily African with small indigenous signals. That tension feels personal. It is structural.
The system created the confusion, then blamed families for having it.
Yes, race replaced nationhood because race was easier to manage. Nations require treaties and recognition. Race requires boxes. Once identity became racial, respect became conditional.
Conclusion: racialization prioritizes administrative efficiency over cultural accuracy.
There are some people today who are socially black and primarily indigenous by ancestry. This occurred where indigenous people were reclassified, African ancestry was minimal or absent. Social identity followed law rather than biology. These cases are real. They are rare, regional, and specific. They do not redefine Black American origins.
Acknowledging them restores honesty without erasing Africa.
Precisely. This history should not be used to deny African ancestry, claim purity, police identity, undermine native sovereignty. Repair does not require replacement.
Ethical constraint: ancestry research must avoid zero-sum outcomes.
Here's the takeaway from Act 4. Indigenous communities endured while records vanished. Nationhood was replaced by racial categories. Afro-Indigenous histories were flattened administratively. Census data requires context. Identity confusion today is the inheritance of erasure. In Act 5, the focus shifts to repair. I will lay out a clear, responsible method for combining DNA, records, and oral history. And I will lock the big picture so this history cannot be misused. Before moving into method and repair, the big picture must be stated clearly. This is the population-level reality in the United States. About 85 to 90% of Black Americans are primarily African-descended, with ancestry tracing to West and Central Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. Many people in this group also carry small amounts of indigenous ancestry, especially in the Southeast. That indigenous ancestry is real. It does not replace African ancestry. About 8 to 12% of Black Americans have both African and indigenous ancestry. These Afro-Indigenous lineages formed through shared geography, coercion under slavery and colonization, intermarriage, and legal racial reclassification. African ancestry remains present alongside indigenous ancestry. About 0.5 to 2% of Black Americans, at most, are people who are primarily indigenous to the Americas with little or no African ancestry, but were socially and legally classified as Black due to racial laws, particularly in the Southeast. This group exists. It is real. It is small, regional, and specific. It does not redefine Black American origins. Indigenous erasure happened. African ancestry is real and documented. DNA has limits. Records were manipulated. All of these truths can exist at the same time. Replacing African ancestry with a myth of mass indigenous origin is not recovery. It is another distortion. Low indigenous percentages require careful interpretation. If a DNA test shows 1 to 5% indigenous, that typically indicates one or a few indigenous ancestors several generations back, ancestry often originating in the Southeast, underrepresentation of the source population in reference panels. Results that may shift with database updates. Low percentages do not mean family history is false. Indigenous ancestry replaces African ancestry, a wholesale reclassification of origins. Low signals are quiet, not imaginary. They do not rewrite the entire story.
Quiet ancestry still matters. It just doesn't get to take over the narrative.
Correct.
Statistical guidance. Low percentage signals are hypotheses requiring corroboration.
Responsible ancestry research uses triangulation. First, DNA. Use matches and shared segments, not only percentages. Build relative clusters. Identify common ancestors. Second, records. Track census changes across decades. Examine birth, marriage, and death certificates. Review land, court, and church records. Note when racial labels change. Third, oral history. Treat oral history as a lead, not a verdict. Anchor stories in place and time. Cross-check against geography and records. When all three align, confidence increases. When they do not, investigation continues.
Oral history points the way. Records and DNA confirm the path.
Exactly. DNA cannot restore identities erased by law. When a state alters or destroys records, reclassifies entire communities, breaks documentation continuity, DNA can assist, but it cannot reconstruct nationhood by itself. Tribes are nations, not gene clusters.
Conclusion. Genetic data lacks the socio-political context required for legal restoration.
This history should not be used to deny African ancestry, claim genetic purity, police other people's identities, undermine indigenous sovereignty, replace one erased history with another. If a conclusion requires someone else to disappear, it is wrong.
Ethical constraint. Avoid zero-sum identity frameworks.
Confusion persists because identity grief seeks simple answers. Africa was stigmatized. Indigenous identity was erased. Records were manipulated. Replacement stories feel cleaner than layered truth. Clean does not mean accurate.
Truth doesn't need purity to be dignified.
It doesn't. This sentence captures the evidence. Some indigenous people were reclassified as Black, and a very small number of Black Americans today are primarily indigenous. But the vast majority of Black Americans are African descended, often with some indigenous admixture. Erasure happened, replacement did not. That statement is accurate, complete, and defensible. You do not need genetic purity to honor your ancestors. You do not need to erase Africa to acknowledge indigenous pain. You do not need a DNA percentage to justify belonging to your family. Belonging is a responsibility, not a calculation. Across this series, the evidence shows law reshaped identity on paper. Records were manipulated. DNA is powerful but limited. Communities endured even when documentation did not. Most Black Americans are African descended. Some carry indigenous ancestry. A very small number are primarily indigenous. All of these truths coexist.
Final synthesis. Accuracy and compassion are compatible.
This series was not about choosing an origin. It was about telling the truth without fear. Truth does not need exaggeration. It does not need erasure. It does not need replacement. It needs care.
And courage.
And precision.
Thank you for staying with the complexity.